Hi, I'm Simone Hubbard from Chapel Arts, and joining me today we have Mark Henderson and Caroline Hardwick, who are members of the Chapel Arts Creative Writing Group. Individual members of the group entered a short fantasy horror competition, and that was launched by Fantastic Books Publishing in 2019, and it elicited well over 100 entries, where the photograph behind myself and Caroline was the prompt. Of these, 25 were longlisted and will be eligible for publication. This is scheduled for release by Fantastic Books in the summer of 2021 as an anthology. 5 of our Chapel Arts writers submitted entries, and 3 of them were on the long list of 25. 2 of them were awarded first and second prizes, and today we're listening to the authors reading them. We have Caroline Hardwick reading her story, A Study in White, and Mark Henderson reading his story, The Loop. We're very grateful to the publisher, Fantastic Books, for giving us permission to make these recordings, which can be accessed free of charge through the Chapel Arts website. The text of these stories can also be found on the same website. So I'm going to hand over to Caroline first for her story.
Thanks, Simone. My story is called A Study in White. It's that time, the perfect time. I feel the first stirrings of warmth as they reach my face. There is pain, yes, obviously, but the joy of sun on my skin is such that for the moment it is bearable. The thick fog of white turns to mist, then clears, and if I could close my eyes to the stabbing shafts of light, I would instinctively do so, but I can't, so I don't. And the myriad of dancing stars finally fade, leaving the magnificence of vision. The vision that greets me, as it always has over the uncountable years, is of my village, Tabrizen, at its most picturesque. Snow-topped peaks, with Castle Vonung on its rocky base before them. I can see there is still snow on the pastures in the valley, but it will soon be gone. Therein lies the rub. I can now see the garden behind the castle wall from my elevated vantage point. A figure has set off across the sun-dappled snow. It is her. Her figure is unmistakable to me, even stooped with age. She is wearing a long fur-trimmed hooded velvet cloak and thick fur boots. With a sweep, she draws the hood back, and I see her hair is now white. It is a few years since I saw her last, and I wonder how long before I stopped seeing her. I know not whether her visits to the castle have become more infrequent over the years, or if she has varied the times of these visits to suit some new life. I know where she is going, though, and what she holds in a basket over her arm. I remember when the mere sight of her could take me to the dizziest heights. The air would feel rarefied when I was in the same room, thinner than at the top of Mount Airfelt, which towered over the village. She was younger than me by 10 years, but made me feel like an embarrassed teenager whenever I tried to hold conversation with her. Despite my high birth, she seemed to me to be far more regal and sophisticated than my dull intellect could comprehend. Yet Isabella was a mere merchant's daughter. It was inevitable that we would be sworn to each other. My infatuation and her ambition made it so. But the heaven I envisaged would follow remained tantalizingly out of reach. Yes, she gave her flesh to me, but her soul remained resolutely out of reach. After our first son, Algred, was born, I hoped things would change, and they did, but not for the better. Isabella was devoted to the child and refused nursemaids, leaving me alone in my dark, cold bedchamber at night, while she slept in the small, warm nursery on a low maid's mattress beside the child. I was occupied with castle business during the day, but evening and night time weighed heavy. and I could think of nothing but my loneliness. When the child was brought to me for an hour before his bed each night, at least I could see Isabella and attempt conversation, but she remained distracted. Algred was a delightful child, with my red hair and Isabella's grey eyes, and my one consolation was the love I felt when I held him for those few minutes. Eventually, Isabella allowed more of his care to be taken by the nursery nurse, who was despairing of her position. We returned to something more akin to normality, and the seeds of hope started to grow in my mind. Then she was with child again. My pleasure at the news was tainted by the knowledge of what might follow. But by now Algred was able to converse and learn, so I consoled myself that at least I would not be so lonely. And it was so. Whilst Isabella doted on our newborn Estgard, who was as dark-haired as she and as quiet and still, I was able to sit with Algred and tell him tales of Tabrizen and the lands around. I became content rather than happy. Maybe this is the best a man can hope for. The agony is starting, and for the millionth time, I wish with all my soul that I could experience one tiny portion of that contentment ever again. But of course it cannot be. The pain is indescribable. Not one part of my body escapes, and certainly not my spirit, which is beyond hope. I focus again through the pain and wish that I could shed even one tear. I see she has crossed the meadow and is nearing the small walled garden. The green of the late spring grasses shows through white lace as the sunlight focuses its sharp rays on the frosty ground. It was Isabella's idea, the tutor. It seemed so sensible, as our castle was remote, and there were few children in the village, so the school was rudimentary. Although I believed my son should mix with children from many walks of life, I wasn't ready to send them away to study at such a tender age, and before I could firmly instill my principles into them. I secretly hoped that Isabella would have more time for me with the boys occupied for most of the day. I must say I was pleased and surprised when, after much correspondence, Isabella chose a young woman who spoke 3 languages and had travelled the continent to be the boys' tutor. Her hair was a golden halo and her laugh echoed through the stone corridors. Castle Vonung became a happy, sparkling place. The boys skipped and smiled and followed her like innocent puppies. Wherever Christa went, the air became warmer and spirits soared. I should have realised, but I didn't until it was too late. Her knowledge was wide-ranging, and she had some rare science, as well as knowledge of the history of Macedonia and our neighbouring countries. She also knew the names of all the flowers that appeared in the 2 months of the year when the sun melted the snow and ice covering the village and castle, though never that on Mount Airfalt. She melted our hearts and more. It should never have happened. Secret glances, her body close by, then sudden blushes and a step back. I tried to ignore it, but that fateful day, how I wish I could change it now. How I wish that door had stayed closed. But time moves inevitably onwards in one direction. I passed Christa's bedchamber and heard her tinkling laugh, and then more. I hesitated, then turned the handle, opening the ancient oak wide. There they were, wrapped in an embrace, lips on lips, and such passion. I had never seen my cool Isabella in such a state of fervour or enchantment, even though it had been my life's wish. They turned to look at me, and there was neither fear nor apology in their eyes. I knew my life was over. I sat in my study, tears drying on my face. They would go away, I knew it. Isabella would take the boys. My heart was like the frozen boulders that fell from the mountains. I could not live like this. But the idea of the boys living on without me, how they would suffer, how they would miss me. Far better, surely, that we spend eternity in the afterlife together, on the far side of the river, they forever innocent, and with me to guide them. The trip to the village to visit Herr Franz took all my resolve. In my blindsided state, I wore only a thin cloak and soft shoes. Dark was falling, and without the weak sun, the ground had frozen hard again. The alchemist heard my request grudgingly, as he was keen to return to his fire and the open bottle of kummel I could see on the hearth. I told him my favourite horse was in colic, and I could not bear to kill it as it stood, but needed a potion to render it still and calm. He went to the large wooden chest, and after some thought, returned with a bottle and dropper. I handed over the guilt he required, and without so much as a farewell, shut the door behind me and made for my home. It was easy. The boys came to see me before bed. Isabella brought them, and it was as if nothing had happened, though she did look back as she closed the study door, giving me a gentle, sad smile, as if saying farewell to an aged relative. I'd had the cook bring the warm goat's milk with nutmeg that the boys sipped while I talked to them of my life and experiences. I had added many drops of the potion. The rest I had placed in my wine, along with the rat powder from the cellar. As I spoke gently, telling the boys how much I loved them, their eyes glazed, and they both slipped onto the rug. Their breath still came, though, and I held my hand over their mouths and noses. Algerud first, applying pressure until I felt his slight body bucking under my heavy forearm, and then lie still. I tried not to look into Escart's eyes, as I did the same to his frail, tiny form, in case I might see any terror or comprehension. Then I took my chalice, drank the contents, and slid down beside them. I became paralysed, but my breathing continued. Soon, I hoped, soon I would join my sons. Noise, sounds, no screams surrounded me. I could smell her perfume, hear Isabella howling. My body rocked. I could see nothing and feel little, but I could hear everything sharply. Krista was kicking me, whilst Isabella attended to our sons. Running feet stopped as the servants entered. Sharp intakes of breath. I was lifted and taken somewhere, I know not where. My body was moved and discussions ensued. I lost consciousness totally. When I finally re-entered the world, it was to feel pain as my eyelids were opened by unseen hands, then stitched in place. I could not bear the agony and must have lost consciousness again. The next memory was of sitting strapped to a wooden chair as the council of judges sat before me. Evidence was heard from Herr Franz and my stable hand. Then Krista spoke, not a word about Isabella, but about my sons and how they were last taken to me, and how my behaviour that day had been strange and distracted. I was unable to speak or move as the judges pronounced me guilty of the crime of filicide and the equal crime of attempted suicide. My sentence was fitting, some will say. And so it is that I lie here below the ice of the glacier, overlooking my village. Each year, the summer sun melts it just enough for the decomposition of my body to restart. The exquisite pain of rotting while still sentient is nothing compared to the knowledge that I will witness the passing of everyone I have known before I finally die. My soul feels the pain of watching what I cannot experience, whilst knowing when I finally cross to meet my sons again, they will have been in paradise with Isabella. I will never have forgiveness. I can only watch as the distant figure bends to place a posy of wildflowers on our children's graves before the sun drops and a thin frost covers my open eyes.
Wow, thank you, Caroline. That's got me there. Now we have Mark. I didn't mention either. Caroline's story was second in the competition, and Mark's story is actually the winning story. And Mark's gone into a dark background, which might be quite apt when he's read his story. So I'll hand over to Mark, who's now going to read his story, The Loop.
Thank you, Simone, and thank you for organising the recording. It was lovely to hear Caroline's story again, the rises and falls of tension. Beautiful.
Very good.
Anyway, here is The Loop. Everyone had heard of La Boucle. Climbers travelled to those mountains and were reported missing. There were appeals for help, search and rescue bids, helicopters, interviews, and official statements. And sometimes there were rumours of abandoned camps. But in the end, it was accepted that the mountaineers had vanished among the peaks. And over the following days or weeks, their stories dwindled from the news and were forgotten. Franklin and Irvine relished danger. They loved exertion and craved the adrenaline rush. They were fishermen, fell runners, bungee jumpers and mountaineers, and they were young. They'd known climbers who disappeared while visiting La Boucle. How could they resist its allure? They carried their personal effects and gear, ropes, ice axes, crampons, sleeping bags, tents, into the rented chalet, which shimmered with winter light and drowsed amidst odours of freshly cut pine and sealant. The other 5 chalets were untenanted. The 2 men planned to return to the town for dinner, but despite Irvine's ministrations, the Volvo wouldn't restart. The clang of his frustrated boot against the bonnet reverberated across fields of snow and faded over the frozen lake. Dark conifers and the evening sky drank the echoes. The white faces of La Boucle stared from the middle distance. No birds sang. The air smelled deserted. Franklin shook his head. Well, Irv, in the absence of mobile phone signal, neighbours and functioning vehicle, either we walk 20 miles, stuff that, Frank, it'll be dark in an hour, and we don't know, or we beg use of that hotel's landline and call a garage. Franklin assessed the huge stone edifice brooding over the lake, a 19th century mock Gothic mansion built around 12th century castle ruins. Disparate strands of history juxtaposed. He lit a cigar. Hotel? Irvine gave a short laugh. Google said castle, not open to visitors. No other info. Still, I suppose. Their boots crunched over the frozen snow. The castle ruins, monuments of triumph and sorrow, home now to lichens and nesting crows, constituted less than 1/5 of the structure. They couldn't be seen from the main entrance. The steps leading to the studded oak door had been cleared of snow, though not of shadow. Pretentious, pseudo-medieval. Franklin slapped the worn rope dangling beside the doorpost, and then pulled it. Deep within the building, a bell tolled. 20 seconds passed. Then the door glided open. Irvine strode forward, frowning, and sniffed. Pseudo-medieval furniture polish, Frank. He stared into the depths of the hall. Can't see a phone. He tilted back his head and called, Hello? The dark panelled walls vouchsafed no reply. The portraits, hunting trophies, vacant side table, and empty umbrella stand gazed blankly at the intruders. The marble staircase was silent. Franklin cleared his throat. took off his boots and tiptoed into the first room on the left, a library. He pointed to a long red hair on a black leather wingback seat. Irvin, following his lead, shook his head and blinked. Remembering Leonie, thought Franklin. Leonie's no longer in his life. Aloud, he said, "You can't be far away. Chair's warm." They took off their gloves and jackets and began to search the ground floor corridors and rooms. Their meticulous exploration unearthed no occupant. "On a scale of weirdness from 1 to 10, muttered Irvin, "this is a 7. Franklin demurred. 5, Irv. It's warm, carpets and soft lighting, spotlessly clean. Nothing weird, except there's no sign of the scores of staff needed for upkeep. Or the red-haired lady. What do you need for a 7, Frank? Dust and cobwebs, rotting floors, gibbering skeletons. Anyway, I'm hungry. Since there's no one here to welcome us and no visible phone and the car won't start, we'd better go back to the chalet and cook something." After a couple of wrong turnings, they found their way back to the main door. But it was locked. The casements were high and sealed. They climbed on chairs to stare through a library window towards their chalet and the moribund Volvo. The twilight was deepening. Franklin licked his dry lips. Black stubble surrounded them. He felt he should have shaved. "All right, Ev. 7. 6 anyway. 8 going on 9. Irving genuflected. His voice was unsteady. "What now?" "Well, we continue searching. Someone's here somewhere, and there must be other exits." They recovered their boots and outer garments and resumed their search. They could sense the cold of the outside world through 3 other doors. 2 were immovable. The third opened under the ruined castle walls onto a frozen, rugged path. They slid and stumbled among trees and undergrowth to a dilapidated boathouse. Night had fallen, and the cold was menacing. Franklin pulled up his hood. A half-moon cast a bitter light on the ice-bound lake and the peaks of La Boucle. The shadows under the trees and the crumbling 12th century towers were black. In the boathouse was a decrepit rowing boat, timbers rotten, but name freshly painted. Vado Mori. Franklin gave a hollow laugh. "What's it mean, Frank?" "It would be unwise to launch it. It would disintegrate before we were halfway across the lake." They both loved fishing, selecting the bait, casting the line, playing with the prize. But not this lake, this boat, this night. All that in 2 words. Economical bloody language, eh? Mellon is more of a Latin scholar than I am, but I know the phrase. It means prepare for death. Well, that's cheered me up. So, no way across the lake. We'd never got through that undergrowth. Franklin stared up at the arrow slits in the medieval towers, grinning in the moonlight. "Agreed. Back into the hotel, if it is a hotel. At least it's warm." He sniffed. "And I smell cooking." They followed their noses to the dining room. It boasted a long, polished oak table surrounded by 13 chairs under a gleaming chandelier, carved cupboards and sideboards, and a covered hot plate exhaling appetizing aromas. Irvin marched to the hot plate and lifted lids. Franklin surveyed the table. It was laid for 2. He licked his lips again. Garlic mushrooms, creamy wine sauce. Irvin sounded mesmerized. "And dessert." He whispered an obscenity. Frank, if you'd ordered a main, what would you have chosen?" "Veg lasagna, probably." "Yeah, guess what? And the sirloin steak and trimmings are mine, right?" The food was freshly cooked. Franklin poured wine. a vintage Saint-Emilion for Irvin and a cool Sancerre for himself, and extolled the high-end catering and the professionalism of the invisible chef and serving staff. He grinned. Irvin snarled, "Shut up, Frank," but swallowed his wine and poured another glass. Both men did justice to the meal. Dessert awaited them atop the sideboard, creme brulee. Coffee percolated beside the hot plate. "Feeling better?" Franklin sipped more coffee and lit another cigar. Melanie would have disapproved, but there was an ashtray on the table. It was decorated with 2 verses from The Hunting of the Snark. "No longer hungry," said Irving. "Tired, though. But Frank, this is seriously weird. Odd, but hardly threatening. Our host and their staff choose to remain invisible, but their hospitality is beyond reproach. We must recommend this place on TripAdvisor. Like Google says, Castle isn't open to visitors. And if the owners let us in, why won't they let us out again? Lovely place, great meal, but it's a prank, Irv. It's annoying not to have our stuff in the chalet, but this is just a practical joke. We'll laugh about it later. Relax, have more coffee." Irvin drank more coffee. He wondered whether the alleged prankster, or the red-haired lady, or the staff, might be hiding on one of the upper floors, or perhaps in one of the towers. The 19th century towers, he elaborated, not the 12th century ones, which no longer had upper floors. Or, he added with a nervous laugh, in a cellar. "Irv, I have seen you tackle rock faces and overhanging ice ridges that I would never have attempted without you on the rope. And you're letting a baroque prank in a comfortable hotel unsettle you." "I agree, we should check upstairs." Franklin chuckled. "I'm sure unseen hands will clear the dishes once we've left the dining room." Most of the upstairs furniture lay shrouded under white sheets, though here, too, everything was immaculate. However, 2 ensuite bedrooms were ready for guests. Irving stared and gripped his crucifix, lips moving. The blonde hairs on his neck and forearms rose. Franklin shut his eyes and cleared his throat. "All right, Irv, 8 on your weirdness scale." "It's off the scale." Irving's voice was rough. Their toothbrushes, hairbrushes, and razors were arranged just as they'd left them in the chalet. Franklin's in one prepared room, Irving's in the other. White, fluffy towels invited them into the en-suites. 3 vintage issues of the Alpine Journal lay on Irving's bedside table. On Franklin's sat a copy of Hume's Inquiry into Human Understanding. "How?" Irving waved an incomprehending hand. "With impeccable skill and subtlety." Franklin's smile was tight. "Quite a feat, bringing all our stuff up here without our noticing." He waited until Irving's torrent of invective subsided, and then reasoned their only sensible option was to accept this further display of hospitality gracefully. In the end, Irving conceded. No alternative. During the night, Franklin dreamed of mountaineers who over the years had vanished while visiting La Boucle. Some he'd known personally, others by reputation. They reached out, calling to him, but he couldn't hear their words or interpret their gestures. He awoke to a flawless sunrise reflecting from the ice-clad peaks into his bedroom window. He was annoyed. He despised dreams for their irrationality, and he despised himself for remembering them. Hauling himself out of bed, he shaved, showered, dressed, and went downstairs to the dining room. Breakfast sizzled on the hot plate. Coffee percolated. The table was set for 1. Franklin felt his fists clench. His fingernails bit the flesh of his hands. With studied calm, he turned and mounted the stairs again to Irving's room. There was no response to his knock. He opened the door. Irving wasn't there, nor were his belongings. The room had been cleared. The bed was made and the towels and the ensuite were fresh and dry. The Volvo had gone. Right, Franklin spoke aloud. Irv woke early, found the front door unlocked, went out, managed to start the car and set off. But the front door wasn't unlocked. Franklin returned to the library, sat in the wing-back chair and lit his cigar. The hunting of the snored ashtray was beside him. He acknowledged difficulties with his explanation. Surely, if Irv had found the door no longer secured, he'd have woken him first, not set off alone. Or he'd have left a note. And how had he moved his stuff from the bedroom without being heard? And why? Franklin drew on the cigar and frowned, struggling to rationalize. Deep within the building, the bell tolled. After 20 seconds, the door glided open. 2 young women entered, cautious and curious. Don't see a phone, Lee, said the first. Look, we can't just walk into... If a walkhouse smell and 2 strangers ask for help because their car had broken down, would you refuse? Leonie tossed her head. Her long Titian hair gleamed in the alluring light of the hall. Wow, some place. Come on, someone's around. Else how did the door get opened? She turned left and entered the library. Melanie followed, sniffing the air. There is someone here, she agreed. Can't you smell cigar smoke? She stroked the wing-back chair. Not far away either. Seats warm.
Thank you, Mark. That left on a bit of a cliffhanger there. I think you've just about finished that before you've gone into complete darkness. So thank you again for listening to Caroline's story and Mark's story. As I said, we'll put those onto the Chapel Arts website with the actual text version as well. And maybe the other stories that were sent in originally, because we also have one that was in that top 25. So I think that's it for today. So just say bye. And thank you.